It's November the 18th, 2011, and it is the release day for Zelda Skyward Sword, the 16th game in the franchise. Players were excited because the game looked good when it was first announced a year earlier at E3 2010, when the legendary Shigeru Miyamoto himself came out to show the game off. Nintendo was pushing it hard too. They released a limited edition gold bundle that included a soundtrack and a special golden Wii remote, very reminiscent of the original NES Zelda's golden cartridge. For Skyward Sword, you actually needed that remote or the Motion Plus added on just to play the game. When the game launched, it was loved by critics, landing a 93 on Metacritic and receiving huge praise from outlets like IGN and Famitsu. But what did the sales say? Well, those were strong too. It sold around 195,000 copies in the first week in Japan. By March 2012, it had already hit 3.5 million worldwide, making it the fastest-selling Zelda game of its time. It eventually slowed down, with the Wii itself losing momentum near the end of its lifespan. But the game still went on to sell around 4 million units overall. For a late-era Wii release, Skyward Sword was officially a success. But if you're a modern Zelda fan, this may feel a bit strange because anyone who has spent time online knows Skyward Sword is one of the most divisive games in the series. The reviews at launch were glowing, and many people placed it alongside the very best like Ocarina of Time. Even back then, some reviewers admitted the combat could feel awkward at first, but the overall response was overwhelmingly positive. As the years went by though, the conversation changed. Once Breath of the Wild redefined freedom and exploration in the series, many of Skyward Sword's flaws became harder to ignore. Now, to be fair, saying the game aged like milk is a bit dramatic. It's more accurate to say it hasn't aged gracefully, especially now that the HD version exists and smooths over several of the original Wii version's problems. Don't get me wrong, Skyward Sword is not a bad game. It has some of the highest highs in the franchise, but also some of the lowest lows. So here's why you need to stop defending Skyward Sword. If we talk about Skyward Sword and its issues, the first thing that needs to be addressed is the biggest elephant in the room: the forced motion controls. Today, motion controls are usually optional side features or gimmicks that most players can ignore. But back in 2011, motion controls were still seen as the next big thing. So for Skyward Sword, Nintendo built the entire game around them. Everything from your sword swings to aiming your bow relied on the Wii Motion Plus. Now, to be fair, the motion controls actually worked well most of the time. The combat itself is generally fun for large parts of the game, and when everything clicks, it feels satisfying to slash enemies in the right direction. But the issue was never that it never worked. The issue was that when it failed, even slightly, you felt it immediately. Enemies like bokoblins and Girahim block based on your sword position, so you're expected to strike them from specific angles. When the remote reads your movement properly, it feels clever, but when it misreads your sword swing or loses alignment, it feels like you're fighting the controller instead of the enemy. That said, the combat is also easier than most people remember. Since the sword only really works through a set number of directions, you can often just wildly swing around, and enemies will keep changing their stance until you hit them anyway. Most encounters can be cheesed this way. The only times the game really asks you to be mindful are fights like Girahim, and even then, the opening to attack him is generous enough that it usually isn't a major roadblock. A bigger issue with the combat is that it becomes too focused on the sword itself. In older Zelda games, gadgets and items often played creative roles in combat. In Skyward Sword, the swordplay takes center stage so strongly that many tools feel pushed aside in battle. It's not necessarily bad, but it does remove some of the variety that the series used to have. And then there's the shield parry. It's so easy to pull off and so powerful that it can trivialize many encounters. Enemies stagger, you mash attacks, and the whole fight becomes a joke. Ironically, this goes against the game's own philosophy of thoughtful, directional combat. The next problem was more of a hardware issue than the game's fault itself. Recalibration. The Wii Remote could lose alignment over time, causing Link's sword or your cursor to stop matching your hand position. This was especially annoying with the bow or beetle. You had to pause, reset, and recalibrate just to keep playing smoothly. And because the game was built entirely around motion controls, you were using them constantly. You had to tilt to fly your loft wing, tilt to swim, gesture to throw bombs, wave to play the harp, and physically balance on ropes. Some of it was immersive at first, but over long sessions, it could become tiring. Flying in the sky often felt like work. Swimming in Lake Floria could feel clumsy. Certain boss fights, like the Imprisoned, made failed motion inputs even more frustrating. All of these issues piled up. It led many players to resent the motion controls and everything they brought to the experience. The truth is, the technology was decent for its time, but there was always a gap between what players expected and what the hardware could consistently deliver. A button press works the same every time. Motion controls come with small errors, delays, and drift. For players used to traditional Zelda gameplay, those little failures felt huge, and that's one reason the original Wii version hasn't aged gracefully. In 2011, motion controls were marketed as innovation. Over time, many players came to see them as a barrier between themselves and the game. There's a reason modern Zelda barely uses them anymore. Another major reason this game gets criticized so often is Fi. If you thought Navi was annoying, Skyward Sword somehow found a way to push that idea even further. Fi is the spirit that lives inside the goddess sword and serves as your companion throughout the game. On paper, she exists to guide Link. In practice, she often explains things that are already obvious, repeats information the game has already shown you, and interrupts the flow far too often. One of the earliest examples happened in the Lanayru mining facility with the time shift stones. This is one of the coolest mechanics in the game. You strike a stone, the desert becomes lush again, machines come alive, and the whole environment visually explains what just happened. It's brilliant environmental storytelling, but before you can really enjoy the moment, Fi appears to explain what you already understood. She also handles technical information in ways that completely break immersion. If your Wii Remote batteries are low, the game already gives you an icon, but Fi still interrupts to tell you there is a high probability that your batteries are depleted. She does something similar with health. If you're low on hearts, the screen flashes and beeps loudly already. Yet she may still stop you to state the obvious. It even happens with your wallet becoming full. The game already shows you that visually, but Fi still needs to comment on it. This constant over-explaining hurts the feeling of discovery. When you arrive in a new region like Farron Woods or Elden Volcano, Fi often points out your destination immediately. The camera pans to the landmark. Your objective is stated clearly, and then dowsing is introduced as another layer of guidance. Instead of exploring it naturally, the game frequently tells you where to look before you even begin. Now, to be fair, Fi does become less intrusive as the game goes on. By around the Lanayru section, she eases up compared to the opening hours. But the first impression she leaves is so strong that it defines how many players remember her. The worst part might actually be the pop-up message tied to items and collectibles. Pick up a bug or treasure after restarting the game, and you can be forced to read the same explanation again because the game doesn't properly remember you've already seen it. Even people who love Skyward Sword have criticized this for years. It completely disrupts pacing. Design-wise, the problem with Fi is that she represents a safety-first philosophy taken too far. The developers were so worried players might get confused that they removed too much room for curiosity, failure, and self-discovery. Good design teaches players through interaction. Fi often teaches through interruption. It often feels like Skyward Sword does not trust the player. It rarely lets you sit with uncertainty, experiment, or discover things at your own pace. In many Zelda games, a huge part of the fun comes from being dropped into a world and figuring things out by yourself. Whether that means solving a dungeon puzzle, learning a boss pattern, or simply finding where to go next, the player feels involved in the process. Skyward Sword often interrupts that feeling. At times, it can feel like the game is constantly checking whether you understand something and then immediately answering the question for you. It starts in Skyloft. While the opening is not as painfully long as something like Twilight Princess, it is still very guided. Before the adventure properly begins, you need to wake up, find your loft wing, learn to fly, complete the wing ceremony, and go through multiple tutorials. The game wants to make sure you understand everything before it lets you go. To be fair, it does loosen its grip over time. By around the middle of the second dungeon, the hand-holding becomes less aggressive than it is at the start. But those opening hours leave a strong impression, and for many players, that impression never goes away. When you finally reach the surface, the feeling of freedom still doesn't fully arrive. Unlike stepping onto the Great Sea in Wind Waker or leaving the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild, the surface in Skyward Sword feels more structured than open. The regions are designed more like puzzle spaces than living overworlds. Now, that doesn't mean the areas are bad. In fact, many of them are clever and well designed, but they are built around progression challenges rather than free-form exploration. Farron Woods, Eldin Volcano, and Lanayru Desert are more like self-contained obstacle courses than wide worlds to roam through. Dowsing is often used as the clearest example of hand-holding, though this criticism can be overstated. The feature is optional in many situations, and players who don't want to rely on it can ignore it. Still, its existence reflects the game's overall design mindset. If the player might get stuck, provide an obvious tracking tool immediately. Even the dungeons, which are some of the strongest in the game, show this tendency. The camera often pans towards switches, newly opened doors, or objects you need to notice. To be fair, camera guidance had already existed in previous 3D Zelda games, so Skyward Sword did not invent this. But because the game combines it with Fi, tutorials, and objective reminders, it feels more noticeable here. The game constantly wants to make sure you know your goal. It reminds you what you're doing, where you're headed, and what matters next. Even when you already understand the situation, the game can step in again. Over time, that can make the adventure feel less like something you are discovering and more like something you are being walked through. There is also the Gossip Stone hint system in Skyloft, which can outright give puzzle answers if you're stuck. In theory, that's useful. In practice, it adds yet another layer to the game's already full of guidance systems. A good game lets the player drive the experience. Skyward Sword often wants you in the driver's seat, but keeps reaching over to grab the steering wheel. Skyward Sword is easily one of the most linear 3D Zelda games, and linearity itself is not automatically a bad thing. Some of the best games ever made are linear. The issue is how that linearity is presented and how limited the world can feel because of it. To be fair, every pre-Breath of the Wild Zelda game is structured in a fairly linear way. You complete specific tasks, unlock the next dungeon, gain a new item, and move forward. Skyward Sword is not unique in that sense. What makes it stand out is how visible the rails feel. Take Farron Woods early in the game. You land there to search for Zelda, and at first it seems like you're entering an open forest ready to explore. But the area quickly reveals itself as a guided funnel. You meet a Kikwi, then you must find the others in order to unlock the path forward. It creates the illusion of exploration while still following a fixed sequence. Elden Volcano works similarly. You arrive and largely follow the intended route. You meet Mogmas, dig in the required spots, gather the key pieces, and open the Earth Temple. The path is enjoyable enough, but it is still a tightly controlled one. Lanayru Desert is where the formula becomes more creative. The time shift stone mechanic is excellent, and areas like the Lanayru Sand Sea are some of the strongest sections of the game. Sailing across sand that turns into water around your ship is one of the coolest ideas in the series. But even here, progression remains structured. You move from one design challenge to the next, rather than freely charting your own path. And that's the most important distinction. The problem is not that these regions are badly designed. Many of them are fantastic. The problem is that they do not feel like a connected overworld. They feel more like highly polished levels. In fact, Skyward Sword's world design often feels closer to Mario-style stage progression, with Skyloft acting as the hub world rather than a traditional Zelda where the regions feel naturally connected to each other. The game only has 3 main surface regions, and that limitation becomes more noticeable over time. If there had been more regions, more optional side spaces, or stronger connections between the areas, the linear structure might have felt far less restrictive. So yes, Skyward Sword does linearity well in many moments, but it is still linear to a fault, because you can always feel the boundaries of the experience. Skyward Sword being linear would be easier to accept if the game did not revisit the same spaces so often. One of the biggest reasons players lose momentum with the game is repetition. It keeps sending you back to the same 3 regions again and again, sometimes in creative ways and sometimes in ways that feel like obvious padding. Farron Woods is a perfect example. Early on, you arrive searching for Zelda and have to locate the missing Kikwis. Later, you return for a Silent Realm trial. Then near the end of the game, the forest is flooded and you are sent on the Tadtones mission, swimming around to collect musical notes underwater. It changes the mechanics, sure, but it still is another task in the same familiar location. For many players, that section is where the padding becomes impossible to ignore. Elden Volcano follows the same pattern. First, you climb the mountain, use bombs, and work your way to the Earth Temple. Later, you return for another trial. Then during the Song of Hero quest, your items are taken away and the region becomes a stealth section where you recover your gear. To be fair, this is actually one of the better stealth sequences Zelda has ever done. It's tense, different, and more fun than expected, but it is still another return trip to the same area. Lanayru handles repetition the best because it adds stronger ideas each time. The Sand Sea introduces a full side story involving robot pirates, a missing captain, and the Sand Ship dungeon. It's creative enough that many players barely even notice they are still revisiting the same core region. But even here, the pattern remains. That pattern is everywhere in the game. First, you search a region for Zelda. Then, you return to locate a sacred flame. Later, revisit the same land again to meet the dragons during the Song of the Hero quest. Structurally, the game keeps circling back through familiar territory. The boss design also suffers from repetition. The Imprisoned is the most famous example. You fight it 3 separate times in the sealed grounds. Each version adds small twists, but the core loop remains the same. Attack the toes, knock it down, seal the spike. By the 3rd fight, most players are simply tired of it. Girahim also appears 3 times, though his battles are much better because they evolve with each encounter. He gains new attacks, new weapons, and becomes more aggressive. Those fights are genuinely fun, but they still contribute to the feeling that the game keeps recycling major encounters. Even outside those examples, repeated bosses show up elsewhere. Moldarak returns during the Lanayru Sandsea segment, and another pirate robot battle appears later in Skykeep. It all adds up. And that's the issue. Repetition is not automatically bad. Zelda games have always reused structures like collecting medallions, sages, or key story items in the second half. The difference is how fresh those returns feel. Sometimes, Skyward Sword disguises repetition brilliantly. Other times, it feels like the game is stretching itself longer than it needed to be. By this point, it becomes clear that the biggest missed opportunity in Skyward Sword is the sky itself. This should have been the best part of the game, where freedom truly opened up. Instead, it often feels like empty space between objectives. The sky is clearly meant to be this game's version of Hyrule Field, or the Great Sea, a large connecting overworld that ties everything together. At first, it works. Taking off on your loft wing for the first time feels exciting. You leave Skyloft, see floating islands in the distance, and imagine a huge world waiting to be explored. But that feeling fades once you realize how little is actually out there. Most of the sky is just open air. There are no major towns beyond Skyloft, few meaningful surprises, and not much happening between destinations. Instead of discovering a living overworld, you often just fly from Skyloft to a beam of light and dive back down to the surface. That's what hurts the game's sense of scale. Since the surface regions already feel like structured levels, the sky should have been the place where you could wander, get distracted, and uncover secrets naturally. Instead, it often functions more like a hub world or menu screen connecting the real levels below. Now, there are optional locations: Fun Island, Beetle's Airshop, bamboo minigames, small islands with treasure, heart pieces, and side activities. They all exist. But many of these places are tiny and single-purposed. You land, you do the one thing there, and leave. They rarely feel like places with depth. The Goddess Cube system captures this problem perfectly. You strike a cube on the surface, and a chest appears somewhere in the sky. On paper, that sounds like exploration. In practice, the game often marks the location for you. So, instead of naturally stumbling into secrets, you're commuting to coordinates for a reward. And this is why the world can feel disconnected. The surface regions are separated from each other, and the sky between them lacks enough substance to make the whole world feel alive. If the sky had more regions, more mysteries, more settlements, or more dynamic events, it could have transformed the entire experience. Instead, the sky promises freedom, but mostly delivers transportation. The biggest overall issue with Skyward Sword, in my opinion, is the pacing. Many of the problems discussed before, fee, tutorials, repeated areas, constant interruptions, travel time, and motion control friction all feed into one larger problem. The game constantly comes between you and the adventure. It starts in Skyloft. Now, to be fair, the opening is not unbearably long compared to something like Twilight Princess, as I said before, and the characters are charming. The world building is strong. The relationship between Link and Zelda is one of the best in the series. But the opening still takes its time. You wake up, search for your loft wing, learn the basics, complete the wing ceremony, and sit through multiple story scenes before the main quest truly begins. On a first playthrough, that can be fine. On replays, it becomes much more noticeable. That's where many of Skyward Sword's flaws stand out the most. The game also explains nearly everything at a slow pace. Stamina, dowsing, saving, item use, and other systems are introduced carefully, and sometimes too carefully. Instead of always letting you learn naturally, the game often pauses to make sure you understand. Then there are the text boxes. Picking up bugs, treasures, or materials can trigger repeated messages. The text itself scrolls slowly, and if you want it faster, you often need to hold the button down instead of instantly advancing through it. It sounds small, but across a full playthrough it becomes surprisingly irritating. Travel also affects the pacing. Flying through the sky can feel relaxing at first, but once the novelty wears off, it often becomes downtime with little happening in between. You're just heading from one required destination to another. Even the motion controls add to the slowdown. When the remote drifts, when aiming feels off, or when a sword input gets misread, the game momentum stops. You recalibrate, retry, and continue. None of these things alone would sink the game, but together, they create friction. They slow down what should feel like a smooth adventure. But despite all of that, the love poured into Skyward Sword is obvious. Its story is heartfelt, its dungeons are excellent, its soundtrack is fantastic, and some of its ideas are genuinely brilliant. That's what makes the game so frustrating and so fascinating at the same time. Skyward Sword has some of the highest highs in the Zelda franchise, and some of the lowest lows. A lot of criticism aimed at Skyward Sword is specifically aimed at the original Wii version, and to Nintendo's credit, the HD remaster on Switch directly addresses many of the game's biggest complaints. It doesn't completely reinvent the game, but it smooths out enough rough edges that the experience becomes far easier to appreciate. One of the biggest improvements is the pacing. In the original game, cutscenes could be skipped after you had already seen them once or by replaying on hero mode. In the HD version, you can skip them immediately. That alone makes replays dramatically better. The text speed is also massively improved. Dialogue now displays much faster, similar to Twilight Princess HD or Breath of the Wild. You can read instantly, mash through repeated lines, and keep the adventure moving instead of waiting through slow text scroll after slow text scroll. Fee was one of the most common complaints in the original series, and the remaster fixes that in the simplest way possible. She mostly leaves you alone. Instead of constantly forcing interruptions, Fee now appears when you actually need her or when you choose to ask for help. Her early game pop-ups are heavily reduced, and most of her remaining dialogue can be skipped quickly. She goes from one of the game's biggest annoyances to a much more manageable companion. For players who never liked motion controls, the HD version adds full button-only controls. This is huge. Now players who prefer traditional inputs, have hand mobility issues, dislike gesture-based gameplay, or are left-handed have another way to enjoy the game. The right stick controls the sword, which feels strange at first, but once it clicks, it works surprisingly well. It also means Skyward Sword is no longer locked behind one control philosophy. You can finally play it the way you want. Motion controls are still included, and they feel good in many situations. In theory, they can misalign faster than the Wii version because the Switch lacks the Wii sensor bar, but Nintendo smartly made recalibration far easier. Now the Y button is dedicated to resetting your aim instantly. You can tap it anytime as often as needed, even in ridiculous moments such as during a cutscene. So while recalibration may be needed more often, it is much less disruptive than the Wii version, where recalibrating happened less frequently but pulled you out of the game far more when it did. The game also runs at a smooth 60 FPS with upgraded HD visuals. That makes a huge difference. Combat feels snappier, movement feels smoother, and menus feel faster. And the whole presentation? It's cleaner. Combined with a 1080p texture upgrade, Skyward Sword finally looks and feels closer to how many people remembered it in their heads. One of the most irritating issues in the original game was repeated time explanations every time you booted the game back up. Bugs, treasures, and materials constantly reminded you what they were. The HD version removes this nonsense. You pick things up and keep moving like normal, as the game should be, even when you restart your game. Skyward Sword HD doesn't erase every flaw in the original design. The world is still linear, the sky is still sparse, and repetition still exists. But by fixing the friction points pacing, fee, controls, performance, and intrusive pop-ups, it gives the game a real chance to be judged by its strengths instead of being buried under its old frustrations. It must be clear to you that the game has some areas which are a clear problem. The opening scene, the backtracking to the regions and bosses, all of these things really hurt the game and its gameplay. And also, fee. How do I describe my feeling towards fee? Let's just leave it at press the L button to turn your YouTube video back 5 seconds out of 10. As always, if you like the video, feel free to leave a like down below, and if you dislike it, feel free to hit the dislike button and let me know in the comments as to the things I could change or improve on to make this a better experience for you. On that note, I will see you guys another time, and be sure to check out our video on why Breath of the Wild is the perfect open world next. Take care.